Again, we appreciate you taking time out of your schedule to join us on this program as we open up another portion of God's Word. You know, sometimes parents might be ashamed of some of the things their children do. And sometimes children, especially teenagers, it seems, may be ashamed of their parents. They may be ashamed of their lack of education or their poverty or some other things. Are we ashamed of God? You know, we sometimes sing the song, I'm not ashamed to own my Lord. Well, that's a good song. And indeed, we should not be ashamed to God. But we often wonder, while we know we're not ashamed of God, I wonder if God might be ashamed of us. I dare say to most people, their thought had never even entered their mind that God might be ashamed of me. But in chapter 11 and verse 16 of the book of Hebrews, we find these words, but now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. Here in this verse it said that God is not ashamed of these people, these patriarchs, the ones he just talked about previously in this very same chapter. And he said God is not ashamed of those people. But we know that God is ashamed of some people. For instance, Christ said in Mark chapter 8 in verse 38, for whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes in his glory of his Father with the holy angels. Notice there Christ says that the people he's going to be ashamed of are the ones that are ashamed of him. That is, the ones that refuse to acknowledge a relationship with Christ. The ones that refuse to acknowledge any type of belief in Jesus. Then God is going to be ashamed of them. So the question is God going to be ashamed of us? As we've already mentioned, there were some people God was not ashamed of in chapter 11, verse 16. Now, why was God not ashamed of them? Well, we find in verse 13, just a couple of verses earlier, it said that these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off and were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Notice it starts out by saying that these all died in faith. Well, how can you die in faith? Well, the only way to die in faith is to live by faith. Galatians 3 verse 11 said, the just shall live by faith. Now, in our modern world, we have a large misunderstanding of what it means to live by faith. Indeed, in the minds of some people, all it simply means is to acknowledge that Jesus is the Son of God. And by doing that, then that means you're living by faith. Or living by faith might simply mean acknowledging that and confessing your faith in that fact. Well, certainly Paul is not saying that simple acceptance of certain truths is all we need. Rather, he was stressing the exact opposite of that. When it said the just shall live by faith, it means to have a faith that works and moves us to obey like Abraham. Previously in this chapter 11 of Hebrews, we find that Abraham left his home. He left all his family simply because God told him to. And that's what it means to live by faith. It means you live in accordance to what God is telling you to do. It is also a faith that is faithful. Faith and faithfulness cannot be separated. It's like two sides of the same coin. We have to persevere to the end. You have to continue living by faith, living according to God's promises and commandments all the way to the very end. So that's what we need to do in order to make sure God is not ashamed of us, and that is to live by faith so that we can die in faith. But it also says in that same verse, verse 13 that we just read, that they confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims. Abraham confessed he was a stranger in Genesis 23 and verse 4. We find Jacob confessing to Pharaoh in Egypt that he was a pilgrim, Genesis 47 and verse 9. The psalmist wrote in Psalm chapter 39 and verse 12, I am a stranger with you, a sojourner as all my fathers were. And then, of course, in the New Testament, we find these words from the book of 1 Peter, chapter 2 and verse 11. Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against your soul. Indeed, these verses points out that as children of God, that we are strangers and pilgrims as far as this world is concerned. You know, in the minds of most people, to be a stranger or a pilgrim would be a terrible situation. Now, to be a stranger or a pilgrim has reference to the fact that you are an alien or a foreigner in a strange land. For instance, if I'm from the U.S. and I go to India, which I have on many occasions, then when I'm in India, I am a foreigner, a stranger. Well, that's how we are on the earth. No matter what country we might live in, that we are really strangers and pilgrims on this earth because we are not at home. This world is not our home, but heaven is our home. And that's the country we are desiring. We find beginning in verse 14, those various sentiments. For those who say such things, declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they call to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God. You see, God is not ashamed of us if we are yearning and desiring a better country. We are indeed should be yearning for and have a deep, earnest desire for that home in heaven. We desire a heavenly country, which would be our own. That's in contrast to our home which on this earth, which is never really our own. Even though you may have physical title to a piece of property or a house, that is not really your home. Not in eternity, because your home is in heaven. And because these patriarchs were looking for a heavenly home, then they followed God wherever He called them to go. And because they were looking for that heavenly home, they focused little attention on their earthly home. Indeed, they could have gone back if they'd wanted to. These patriarchs, like Abraham, that left their homeland, he went journeyed to Canaan as God commanded him to. But these verses point out that he did not stay in Canaan because God forced him there. They could have went back if they chose. They were not forced to leave, and nothing physical prevented them from going back. But why did they not leave then? Well, because their hearts were in Canaan. That's where God was, and that's where their mind was. That's where they wanted to stay in accordance to the will of God. But this shows the possibility of apostasy. Just as these patriarchs could have went back to the country of Chaldea where they had come from, if they had chosen, so we Christians can go back into the world of sin if we so choose. You see, our renunciation of this world is a daily process. And yet, how often do people become Christians, but then they spend much of their time looking back at their previous life? We often become like the children of Israel, who at the first sign of trouble wanted to go back to Egypt. Well, we become like them. At the first temptation, we think about, oh, how we could avoid this if we had just simply not become a Christians. We often dread the thought of approaching to eternity because we want to live here just a little while longer. We become like Lot's wife. We look back with longing at what we give up. We look back at longing at how other people are living, seemingly enjoying all the good things of life while we may be suffering for God. And we look back at longing, maybe envious of other people. Well, that's not how it should be. Yes, we may be suffering some things and we might not have all the good things of this life like some of the other people do, but we need to remember that this is not our home. We're just strangers and pilgrims here. Our home is in heaven. We're looking forward to a heavenly home. And since we're looking forward to that heavenly home, then indeed we should be content no matter where we might be. You remember the Apostle Paul said, I have learned to be content in whatever state I am. In other words, he had learned to be content whether he was in need or whether he had plenty. It really did not matter. He was content. He was able to be content because he was looking forward to that heavenly home. Peter describes this inheritance for in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. He said, to an inheritance incorruptible and undefiled, and that does not fade away, reserved in heaven for you. Yes, we have a home reserved for us. And indeed, it's an inheritance that incorruptible and does not fade away. You see, everything on this earth fades away. Everything on this earth corrupts and rots or cankers or it rusts or something happens to it. It fades away. But our home in heaven does not fade away. And it's reserved for you. That's why we don't get too attached to this world, because we're looking for that heavenly home. And as long as we're looking and desiring and yearning for that heavenly home, then God is not going to be ashamed of you. Is God ashamed to be called your God? Indeed, for some, he would be. For those who claim to be a Christian and yet live like the world, yes, he's going to be ashamed of them. For those who are ashamed of the gospel of Christ, yes, God is going to be ashamed of them too. You see, heaven is a matter of committing your life to God and doing it from the heart. It's not a matter of just doing certain things like we might think, but it's a matter of obeying from the heart the things that God has said to us. Now think on the other hand, though. We've been talking about the fact and asking the question, is God ashamed of you? Are we ashamed of God? I hope not. But also think about the other hand. Think about the time you're living your life and your life is over and you come to face the King in judgment, the Almighty King, the King of the universe. And he's coming to you and passing judgment upon you. And he says, I am not ashamed of you. Well, wouldn't that be great words to hear? When God confesses that you are his child and that he is not ashamed of you. And then we can hear the words that we all want to hear. Come into my home, good and faithful servant. Indeed, that's what we should be looking for. And we can have that if we'll just not be ashamed of God and yearn for that heavenly home. And since we're yearning for it, live in such a way that God has commanded us. I hope this will encourage you to live your life so that you can have that home in heaven. Thank you.